Hello ladies and gents, my name has been Penny, it will continue to be Penny, and welcome back to another episode of Hating Winter with Your Whole Being. I'm casting away the days of the rotgirl winter, no longer are we smoking cigarettes and, listening to Mitski girls. It's time to get things together. But yeah, let's get into Tumblr, Lana Del Rey and Earl Sweatshirt, along with overcoming lifelong misery. Yeah, very cheery topic, I know, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I spoke in a previous video about overcoming depression and how after you were out of that sort of all-encompassing mind state, for many of us there's sort of like a hesitancy or like a looming feeling that the depression's going to come back. And I want to talk more now about how that encapsulation is somewhat caused by ourselves. Off the bat, I want to say that suffering is not purpose, at all. I made this mistake for a really long time. We all know Sisyphus, right? That Greek guy pushing the big rock. There is another side of that, which is this constant cynicism that's really easy to stay in. And I think it was all around us, especially if you're a similar age to me, which I'm nearly 22. I think I'm going to do a video about that. But anyway, I remember growing up and seeing on Tumblr, smart people are sadder because they recognize the darkness in the world. It's they're so aware of how things truly are. I think if you grew up on this sort of Tumblr sad girl vibe, you'll recognize that rhetoric. Lana Del Rey and Mitski are just my muses and they really embody me. I genuinely believed a lot of that, and I 100% crafted my identity around it for a really long time as a teenager. Don't get me wrong, I think a lot of teenagers do this, and I think it's somewhat an important part of developing as a person, to recognize our own mind's ability to craft identity around things that are bad for us. But I've started to think on a certain level that this is kind of self-obsession. I'm aware when I say that I sound like that meme of, I think it's Jemima Kirk, where she's like, girl, you're thinking about yourself too much. But I can't pretend like there wasn't a draw to this nihilistic, depressed identity that I found myself actively tunneling towards as a teenager. And the art I consumed heavily reflected this. While my elders would tell me that, of course, I was feeling down, I spent all my time listening to XXXTentacion. I was 14. Give me a break. Right. We know he's cringe now, but I was 14. And Radiohead, which is hardly going to make you feel... if you wake up first thing in the morning, you're walking to school, you're listening to Climbing Up the Wall off of OK your day's going to suck. It's hardly going to make you feel good. But I think it was the reverse of what people around me would say, where I desperately seek this identity in order to sort of rapture myself. So instead of the music making me sad, I was seeking out sad music. And I think there was a lot of that in the 2010s. I mean, not as much anymore. The last album that I can think that was really like that is Billie Eilish's When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? But one album that is kind of on this subject, but much more positive, is Some Rap Songs by Earl Sweatshirt. It's largely about overcoming grief and depression, and on one of my favourite songs on the album, he says, why ain't nobody tell me I was bleeding? Please, nobody pinch me out this dream. And I think about those two lines, surprisingly a lot. These two lines, for me, perfectly embody this sort of state that I'm talking about. While I objectively did have people around me that cared for me, and I am very lucky in that regard, I was also so hyper-focused on this being my identity and who I am that I largely ignored it because I felt like I deserved this sad girl persona. I deserved this sense of self that was ultimately incredibly negative. And I think that's where the please nobody pinch me out this dream part of these two lines comes in. When you're in that space and you're tunneling towards negativity for a reason to a certain extent that you don't understand, but you, to a certain extent, you believe that this is what you deserve, or whatever the opposite of this all-encompassing negativity is something that you can't or don't have. I found that suffering internally and to a certain extent externally became me. It became my identity. It fueled me. It was a kind of inspiration. But obviously, ultimately, it wasn't. It was an endless rabbit hole I found myself running down. Or better yet, more like an ostrich putting its head in the sand. In this way, I think at a fundamental level, the hashtag sad girl vibes and persona are largely a way of coping with larger issues, but more importantly, a replacement for a fundamental lack of self-value. The nobility of suffering ultimately being a greater good that somehow connects you more to the real world, which, looking back, is so immature. This cycle is really vicious, and your perspective is entirely framed by it when you're in that mind state. And you don't realize that until you attack the original issues or find the desire to move on from this constant self-depreciation. Because perspective is a vicious thing. I'm a quote-unquote romantic, but I misuse that phrase a lot. The more accurate way of describing what I mean is mindfulness, which to me is sort of the opposite of nihilism and cynicism. Now, I'm not going to go on like a Camus-fueled rant about how absurdism is actually great. But I recognise that the deconstruction of this negative persona I found myself in the pit of was shifting my perspective of the things within me. Once I pinched myself out of that dream and recognised the fact that, like, hey, this is kind of crazy, but maybe I do deserve to be happy and not, like, miserable constantly. And it's not cool to actually, like, hate the world. It just sort of acts as a barrier for all the negative things I'm ignoring, but also blocks out all the really positive stuff too. When I realised that, that's when my perspective truly shifted. There is a lot of beauty around us, and it's really easy to miss if you aren't actively looking for it. And I don't mean that in terms of, like, birds chirping and trees, but more so kindness towards one another, growth, change, and expression. The more human parts of life. While I'm saying this, I'm hardly the most mindful. I do occasionally absolutely doom spiral after using X the Everything out for 15 minutes, just completely melting down about the state of the world. You know, I see one Kanye tweet and I'm like, what happened? But that's not useful to me or like anyone around me. I don't want to come across like someone who has it all figured out. I don't. This whole channel is literally me figuring it out. But while I'm doing that, I do feel joy and thankfulness for the work that I've done and the things I've let go of, including this persona. At a fundamental level, I think I will always have this sort of angsty, cynical, sad part of me that wants to express herself, but I ultimately know that's not what's best for me. Over time I will, and I have been growing around that sad archetype with the fat of experience and the scars of a life lived, growing around a bone-cold persona that ultimately never was happy and exclusively kind of relied on its own pain. So yeah, I did believe that nobody told me I was bleeding. A part of me didn't want to get pinched out of that dream, but deep down I knew there was another option, and looking back on those times, I'm forever grateful that I eventually saw a different side to life. It's not easy to disconnect from a negative identity because you connected to it in the first place for a reason, and you know, you sort of have to confront those things, and that's really scary. But I think it does more damage staying inside it. And I have no problem with teenagers romanticizing their melancholy. I think that'll be a thing forever. But I think it's also a part of maturing, of realizing that, hey, maybe, you know, this isn't the best thing for me. And that's not to talk about like active mental illness. That's, you know, that's a much more serious topic with a lot more implications and a lot more issues that need to be worked through. But one part of me overcoming my very real depression was changing my perspectives. And that came from deconstructing this sort of identity that I had. So yeah, fuck Mitski, fuck Lana Del Rey. No, I still listen to Mitski quite a lot. I still love Radiohead. But yeah, you know, in doses. I can't listen to it all the time because I don't think it's particularly good for me. I'll stick to my Doechii. And, you know, I've been listening to a lot of Frost Children. Check out Frost Children's Elevator music set if you haven't seen it. It's so good. But anyway, thank you for listening to me. My name has been Penny. Pull over if you get tired. Call me back. And bye.